This episode is titled Justinian Sayin. During the 5th century, while the Western Roman Empire was falling to the Goths, the Eastern Empire centered at Constantinople looked like it might carry on indefinitely. Though it identified as Roman, historians refer to the eastern region as the Byzantine Empire and era. It gets that title from Byzantium, the city's name before Constantine made it his new capital. During the 5th century, the entire empire, both east and west, went into decline. But in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian I led a major revival of Roman civilization. Reigning for nearly 40 years, Justinian not only brought about a reflowering of culture in the east, he attempted to reassert control over those lands in the west that had fallen to barbarian control. A diverse picture of Justinian the Great has emerged. For years, the official, or what we might better say the approved way to see him, was as an intelligent, ambitious, energetic, gregarious leader plagued by an unhealthy dose of vanity. Dare I say it? Why not? Although he never made up red ball caps, Justinian just wanted to make Rome great again. While that's been the traditional way of understanding Justinian, more recently that image has been edited slightly by giving his wife and queen, Theodora, a more prominent role in fueling his ambitions. Whatever else we might say about this husband and wife team, they were certainly religiously devout. Justinian's reign was bolstered by the careers of several capable generals who were able to translate his desire to retake the West into reality. Maybe the most famous of those generals was Belisarius, a military genius on par with a Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. During Justinian's reign, portions of Italy, North Africa, and Spain were reconquered and put under the Byzantine rule. Apart from some notable exceptions, Western emperors in Rome's long history were austere in the demonstrations of their authority by keeping their wardrobe simple and the customs related to their rule modest, as befitted the idea that the emperor was the princeps, meaning the first citizen. Rome had long abhorred the idea of kings, hearkening all the way back to the years when the Etruscans had dominated them and the Latins had suffered under the heavy hand of tyrannical Etruscan monarchs. These years of the Republic, prior to the Emperor Augustus, saw Rome ruled by the Senate and presided over not by one but by two consuls who could check each other's power. The consuls made a great show of eschewing pretensions that they aspired to be king. Julius Caesar was victim of a plot among some senators because they feared that he was about to install himself as king. Even after his nephew Octavian managed to pull together the fraying threads of government with his uncle's assassination to become Rome's first real emperor, Augustus, the head of state at Rome continued the tradition of avoiding the appearance of monarchy by a simplicity of dress and really a lack of ostentatious court pomp. It was very different in the East. The emperors who ruled in Constantinople went the other way in favor of an Oriental, or we might say a Persian, model of majesty. It began with Constantine, who broke with the long-held Western tradition of imperial modesty and arrayed himself as a glorious Eastern monarch. Following Constantine, Eastern emperors wore elaborate robes and crowns, and they tended to festoon their courts with flamboyant symbols of wealth and power. Encouraged by his wife Theodora, Justinian advanced this trend and turned his court into a majestic showcase. When people appeared before the emperor, they had to prostrate themselves as though bowing before a god. The pomp and ceremony of Justinian's court was quickly duplicated by the church at Constantinople because of the close tie between church and state in the East. It was this ambition for glory that moved Justinian to embark on a massive building campaign. He commissioned the construction of entire towns, roads, bridges, baths, palaces, and a host of churches and monasteries. His enduring legacy was probably the Church of the Holy Wisdom, also known as the Cathedral of St. Sophia, which was the main church of Constantinople. Known today as the Hagia Sophia, it was the epitome of a new style of architecture that was centered on the dome, which was the largest of that time. Visitors to the church could stand for hours in awe, just staring up at the dome, incredulous that such a span could be built by human beings. Though the rich interior of the facade of the church has been gutted by years of conflict and remodel, the basic structure stands to this day as one of Istanbul's premier attractions. Justinian was no mean theologian in his own right. As emperor, he wanted to unite the church under one creed and worked hard to resolve the major dispute of the day. That was the divide between the Orthodox faith as expressed in the Council of Chalcedon and the Monophysites, which we've covered in previous episodes. Justinian tried to reconcile the Orthodox faith, centered at Constantinople, with the Monophysites who were based in Egypt by finessing the words that had been used to describe the faith. Even though the Council of Chalcedon had officially ended the debate, there was still a rift between the church at Constantinople and that in the East. Justinian tried to clarify how to understand the natures of Jesus as God and human. Did he have one nature or two? And if two, how did they coexist in the one Son of God? Were they separate and distinct or merged into maybe something new? And if they were distinct, was one superior than the other? This was the crux of the debate that the Council of Chalcedon had struggled with. Justinian had partial success in getting moderate Monophysites to agree with his theology. He was helped by the work of a monk named Leo of Byzantium, who proposed that in Christ his two natures were so commingled, so united, that they formed one nature, which he identified as the Logos. In 544, the Emperor Justinian issued an edict condemning some pro-Nestorian writings. You may remember that Nestorius had been a strong advocate for the two natures of Christ being co-equal. Now, many Western bishops thought that edict was a scandalous refutation of the Chalcedonian Creed, which had, in effect, endorsed Nestorius' writings, even though they banished him as a heretic. Now, they assumed that Justinian had come out as a Monophysite. Pope Vigilius condemned the edict and broke off fellowship with the Patriarch of Constantinople because he supported the emperor's edict. Shortly after, when Pope Vigilius visited Constantinople, he did an abrupt about-face, adding his own censure to the condemned pro-Nestorian writings. Then, in 550, after several bishops criticized this reversal, Vigilius did yet another and said that the writings weren't prohibited after all. Nothing like being a stalwart pillar of an unwavering stand. Vigilius was consistent, and he consistently wavered when under pressure. All of this created so much controversy that in 1553, Justinian had to call the Fifth Ecumenical Council held at Constantinople. Though it was supposed to be a council of the whole church, Pope Vigilius refused to attend. At Justinian's demand, the council affirmed his original edict of 544, further condemning anyone who supported the pro-Nestorian writings. The emperor then censured Vigilius for his refusal to attend, saying that he would be reinstated only on the condition of his accepting the council's decision. And guess what Vigilius did? Yeah, he relented and endorsed the council's finding. So the result was that the Chalcedonian Creed was now reinterpreted along far more Monophysite lines, the very thing that the Chalcedonian Council had attempted to undo. Jesus' deity was elevated to the foreground while his humanity was relegated to a distant backwater. This became the official position of the Eastern Orthodox Church. But Justinian's desire to bring about unity wasn't achieved. The Western bishops refused to recognize the Council of Constantinople's reinterpretation of the Chalcedonian Creed. And while the new spin on Jesus' nature was embraced in the East, the hardcore Monophysites of Egypt stood their ground. They'd come to hold their theology with a fierce regional loyalty. To accept Justinian's formulation was deemed by them a compromise they saw as not only heretical, but as unpatriotic. They vehemently refused to come under the control of Constantinople. What Justinian was unable to do by theological compromise and diplomacy, he attempted by force. After all, as they say, war is just diplomacy by other means. And as Justinian might have said, what good is it being emperor if you can't bash heads every now and then? He also sought to eradicate the last vestiges of paganism throughout the empire. He commanded both civil officials and church leaders to seek out all pagan cultic practices and pre-Christian Greek philosophy and bring an immediate end to them. He closed the schools of Athens, which were the last institutions teaching Greek philosophy. He allowed the Jews to continue their faith, but sought to regulate their practices. He decreed the death penalty for Manichaeans and some other heretics. When his harsh policies stirred up rebellion, he was ruthless in putting it down. And toward the end of his reign, His wife Theodora's Monophysite beliefs influenced him to move even further in that direction. He sought to recast the Fifth Council's finding into a new form that would gain greater Monophysite support. This new view was given the tongue-twisting label of aphthartodocetism. Now, according to this view, even Jesus' physical body was divine, so that from conception to death, it never changed. So Jesus didn't really suffer. He didn't know the desires and passions of mortals. When he tried to impose this doctrine on the church, the vast majority of bishops refused to comply. Justinian made plans to enforce compliance, but died before the campaign could be launched, much to the relief of those said bishops. Justinian took an active hand in ordering the church in more than just theology. He passed laws dealing with various aspects of church life. He appointed bishops, assigned abbots to monasteries, ordained priests, managed church lands, and oversaw the conduct of the clergy. He forbade the practice of simony, which is the sale of church offices. Being a church official could be quite lucrative at that time, and so the practice of simony was frequently a problem. Justinian also forbade the clergy from attending chariot races and the theater. That may seem harsh if we think of these as mere sporting and cultural events. They weren't. Both were more often than not scenes of moral debauchery where ribald behavior was common. One did not attend a race for polite or dignified company. The races were racy, and the theater was a place where pornographic perversions were enacted live on stage. That Justinian forbade clergy from these events means they'd been common for at least some of them to attend before the ban. He authorized bishops to function in a quasi-civil fashion by having them oversee public works and enforcing laws against vice. In some places, bishops served as governors. It was under Justinian that the church became an instrument of the state. That process had begun under Constantine, but it wasn't until Justinian that it achieved an official status. Christianity continued to extend its influence along the borders of the empire. With the reconquest of North Africa, the Arianism that had taken root there was finally eradicated. The faith moved up the Nile into what today is known as Sudan. The Berbers of North Africa were converted. In Europe, barbarian tribes along the Danube were also reached. The divide between the Monophysites and the Orthodox that Justinian had tried to heal continued to plague the church well into the 7th century when a new threat emerged: Islam. Emperor after emperor knew that a fragmented church meant a weakened society which would be easy prey to the new invaders, and so they worked feverishly to bring about theological unity. So let's see. How do we bring the Orthodox and the Monophysites together? Sergius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, had an idea. Based on what were thought to be the writings of one of the early church fathers named Dionysius, Sergius thought that he found support for a new idea that can reconcile the two sides. He said that while Jesus was both divine and human, he worked by only one energy. Now that sounded great to the Monophysites of Egypt, and for a time looked like it would be the new unity. But other bishops cried foul. And so Sergius quickly shifted ground and said, okay, forget about one energy. How about this? Christ was both divine and human, but he possessed only one will, which was a merging of the two natures. Now, in Rome, the then Pope Honorius put his stamp of approval on this, and now with the agreement of the two most influential churches, it looked like a theological slam dunk. So, in 638, the Emperor Heraclius passed an edict expressing Sergius's view and forbidding further debate. The emperor passed an edict. That settles it, right? Not quite. When Pope Honorius died, the next pope announced that Jesus had two wills, not one. Oh, and furthermore, that had been the real position of Honorius all along. He'd just been misunderstood by Patriarch Sergius. Each pope thereafter affirmed Jesus' divine and human wills as distinct, though in harmony with each other. This view held sway in the West as opposed to Sergius's view, which became the position of the East. When in 648 the issue threatened to once again tear the church and empire apart, the Emperor Constans II declared all debate about one or two wills off limits. But wouldn't you know it, when word of the ban reached Rome a year later, Pope now Martin I called a synod to discuss the issue. He decided that Jesus had two wills and denounced the Patriarch of Constantinople. The bishops also said, "How dare the emperor tell us what we can and can't talk about?" Constans II decided to show the Pope how he dared and had him arrested and hauled to the capital, where he was condemned and tortured and then banished. Martin died in exile. Then a funny thing happened. Not really funny, tragic more like. North Africa, that region of the empire that had been so devoted to Monophysitism, was conquered by Islam. And suddenly the debate lost its main voice. So Constantine IV called a Sixth Ecumenical Council, again in Constantinople in 680. This council officially declared the idea of one energy or will in Christ heretical. Jesus had two wills, one divine, the other human. The council claimed its views were in accord with a similar council held in Rome a year before under the auspices of now Pope Agatho. Most church historians consider the Sixth Council to be the last at which the nature of Jesus was the primary theological consideration. To be sure, the Nestorians continued to spread eastward as they made their way to China, and there were still pockets of Monophysitism in Egypt. But in both the eastern and western regions of the empire, Orthodoxy, or what is often called Catholic Christianity, now held sway. As we close this episode, please like, subscribe, hit that little bell icons to get notifications when new videos drop here at Into His Image, and also, please help spread the word. Thanks.